Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to challenge the way you see power, trade, and opportunity. Headlines scream about politics, tariffs, and conflicts, but history rewards those who look beyond the noise. When we hear Trump's 25% NATO tariffs, most people think about strained alliances, higher costs, or geopolitical drama. Very few stop and ask a deeper question. Who benefits quietly when systems are under pressure? And more importantly, where does opportunity hide when fear dominates the conversation? That is where today's silver angle begins. Trump's proposed 25% NATO-related tariffs should be understood less as a conventional trade policy and more as a calculated instrument of economic pressure. At first glance, tariffs appear to be about protecting domestic industries or correcting trade imbalances, but in this case, the deeper objective is leverage. By targeting allies rather than rivals, the policy sends a clear signal. Economic cooperation is no longer unconditional. This immediately changes the negotiating environment, forcing NATO countries to reassess not only trade flows, but their broader strategic alignment with the United States. The real hook is this: tariffs don't need to be permanent to be powerful. Even the threat of them is enough to shift behavior across global markets. When a major economic power introduces such uncertainty, the first casualty is predictability. Businesses thrive on stable rules, long-term contracts, and reliable supply chains. A sudden 25% tariff disrupts those foundations overnight. Companies begin to delay investment decisions, reroute production, and renegotiate pricing structures. Governments, in turn, are pushed into defensive economic planning, accelerating policies such as domestic manufacturing incentives and alternative sourcing. This is where the pressure effect multiplies. A single policy announcement can ripple through logistics, labor markets, and capital allocation long before any tariff is actually collected. Another critical layer is the message these tariffs send to financial markets. Investors interpret tariffs not just as economic measures, but as signals of future policy direction. When allies are targeted, markets read it as a willingness to weaponize trade for strategic outcomes. That perception alone increases risk premiums, strengthens volatility, and forces capital to reposition. Here lies another hook. Markets often react more aggressively to uncertainty than to bad news itself. A known cost can be priced in, but an unpredictable policy environment demands constant reassessment. For NATO economies, the pressure extends beyond trade balances into defense and fiscal policy. If alliances feel economically strained, governments may compensate by boosting internal spending, particularly in defense, infrastructure, and strategic industries. This reshaping of budgets is not accidental. It is part of the leverage mechanism. Tariffs become a silent negotiation tool, encouraging allies to absorb more costs at home rather than relying on global cooperation. Over time, this can redefine economic relationships that have existed for decades. What makes this strategy particularly powerful is its asymmetry. The United States, with its large consumer market, can absorb short-term disruptions more easily than smaller, export-dependent economies. That imbalance magnifies the pressure, even if the tariffs are never fully enforced. The final hook is this: in modern geopolitics, tariffs are no longer just taxes on goods. They are tests of loyalty, resilience, and economic independence, and the outcomes of those tests quietly reshape the global order. Rising geopolitical risk has a predictable yet often underestimated effect on global behavior. It changes where confidence lives. When trade tensions escalate and alliances appear unstable, investors and institutions stop focusing solely on growth and begin prioritizing protection. This shift is not driven by emotion alone. It is rooted in historical memory. Every period of heightened political friction, whether driven by tariffs, sanctions, or strategic realignments, has shown that capital reacts first by seeking safety rather than return. The hook here is simple but powerful. Money moves long before headlines confirm a crisis. As uncertainty grows, trust in policy continuity weakens. Markets are forward-looking, and when governments signal a willingness to use economic tools as political weapons, investors begin pricing in future disruptions. This creates a silent migration of capital away from assets dependent on stable diplomacy and toward instruments perceived as insulated from political decision-making. Bonds, currencies, and equities tied to global cooperation suddenly carry hidden risk premiums. The result is not an immediate collapse, but a gradual rebalancing that favors assets with historical resilience. This is where safe haven behavior quietly takes over. What makes this phase especially significant is the role of institutions rather than retail investors. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and large asset managers do not react impulsively, but they do react strategically. When geopolitical stress rises, these players adjust reserves, diversify exposure, and reduce reliance on any single political framework. These moves are rarely announced in real time, yet they shape markets far more than short-term speculation. The second hook lies here. By the time the public notices a trend, institutional capital is often already repositioned. Another critical dimension is currency confidence. Geopolitical tensions often weaken faith in fiat systems, not because currencies immediately fail, but because their value becomes increasingly tied to political decisions rather than economic fundamentals. Sanctions, tariffs, and alliance disputes expose how quickly access to markets and liquidity can be restricted. In response, investors and governments alike seek alternatives that do not rely on policy promises. This behavioral shift reinforces demand for stores of value that exist outside the control of any single nation. Safe haven behavior also feeds on narrative momentum. As media coverage intensifies around conflict, trade wars, and diplomatic fractures, perception becomes reality. Even the possibility of escalation can trigger defensive positioning. The key hook is that markets do not wait for certainty, they respond to probability. Rising geopolitical risk increases that probability, and capital responds by prioritizing survival over optimization. Ultimately, this environment rewards those who understand cycles of confidence and fear. Economic systems are built on trust, and when that trust is questioned, capital seeks shelter. This is not panic, it is adaptation. And in periods of sustained geopolitical tension, safe haven behavior is not an exception. It becomes the dominant strategy guiding global financial flows. Silver occupies a unique and often misunderstood position in the global economic system, which is precisely why its strategic importance is frequently overlooked. Unlike gold, which is largely held and traded as a monetary reserve, silver operates in two worlds at the same time. It is both a financial asset and a critical industrial input. This dual identity becomes especially powerful during periods of geopolitical tension and trade disruption, when nations are forced to reassess not just what they value, but what they'll physically need to function. The first hook is this. Silver is not just stored for safety, it is consumed for survival. As trade barriers rise and tariffs reshape global supply chains, industrial demand does not disappear. It reorganizes. Defense manufacturing, electronics, energy infrastructure, and advanced technology all rely heavily on silver's conductive and chemical properties. When governments increase defense budgets or push for domestic production to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, silver demand often increases quietly in the background. These are not speculative uses, they are structural necessities. This is where silver's strategic role separates it from traditional precious metals. Another layer of significance lies in supply vulnerability. Silver production is geographically concentrated and often tied to base metal mining rather than dedicated silver operations. This means supply cannot be easily or quickly increased in response to rising demand. When tariffs, sanctions, or geopolitical tensions disrupt mining regions or trade routes, silver markets can tighten rapidly. Here's the second hook. Silver shortages do not announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves through pressure, delays, and rising sensitivity to even small demand shifts. At the same time, silver's monetary history cannot be ignored. It has functioned as money for thousands of years, and during periods of economic uncertainty, that memory resurfaces. But investors seeking protection from inflation, currency debasement, or policy-driven instability often rediscover silver as an accessible store of value. Unlike gold, silver remains affordable to a broader range of participants, amplifying its role during widespread economic stress. This creates a rare convergence where investment demand and industrial demand rise simultaneously. What makes silver particularly compelling in this environment is its underrepresentation in mainstream financial narratives. Media attention typically flows toward equities, currencies, or gold, leaving silver underanalyzed and underowned. This neglect is the third hook. Markets often misprice what they underestimate, and silver's complexity makes it easy to ignore until pressure forces recognition. In a world shaped by trade, fragmentation, and strategic competition, materials that combine monetary trust with industrial necessity gain importance. Silver sits quietly at that intersection, responding not to hype, but to fundamental shifts in how economies defend, produce, and store value. The supply chain disruptions are often discussed in terms of delays, higher costs, or logistical inefficiencies, but their deeper impact on strategic commodities like silver is far more significant. When tariffs and trade barriers interfere with the smooth movement of raw materials and refined metals, they introduce friction into a market that already operates with tight margins and limited flexibility. Silver is not produced in isolation. It is largely a byproduct of mining for copper, zinc, and lead. This structural reality means that silver supply is indirectly controlled by conditions in other industrial sectors, making it especially vulnerable when global trade flows are disrupted. The first hook is this. Silver supply cannot simply respond to price signals in the way many assume. As tariffs raise the cost of cross-border trade, mining companies and refiners face higher input expenses, transportation costs, and regulatory hurdles. These added pressures often lead to delayed projects, reduced output, or conservative production strategies. Unlike consumer goods, metals production requires long-term planning, stable financing, and predictable trade access. When those conditions weaken, supply growth slows, sometimes invisibly. The market may appear stable on the surface, but stress builds beneath it. This is where silver becomes increasingly sensitive to even minor shifts in demand. Another critical factor is the fragmentation of refining and processing capacity. Silver may be mined in one region, refined in another, and consumed in a third. Trade barriers disrupt this global choreography. Policy-driven disruptions intensify this dynamic. Tariffs, sanctions, and trade realignments rarely resolve quickly. As temporary measures evolve into long-term constraints, industries adjust production, sourcing, and investment strategies. Silver demand becomes embedded in these adjustments. Unlike gold, which can be bought and sold without affecting real-world systems, silver demand often represents physical necessity. That necessity turns pressure into persistence, creating conditions where silver pricing becomes more reactive and less forgiving. There is also a psychological layer that amplifies silver's role under pressure. Because silver is traditionally viewed as secondary to gold, it remains under-owned during early stages of uncertainty. This complacency is the third hook. When recognition finally arrives, often through tightening supply or unexpected industrial demand, repositioning can be abrupt. Silver's smaller market size magnifies these shifts, translating marginal changes in demand into outsized price responses. Ultimately, the distinction between gold and silver during periods of stress is not about superiority, but function. Gold tells you that fear exists, and silver tells you that systems are being tested. And when economic pressure becomes embedded in policy, production, and supply chains, silver stops whispering and starts responding in ways that few see coming until the movement is already underway. So, the true impact of NATO-related tariffs does not lie in their immediate economic disruption, but in the second-order effects that unfold quietly over time. These are the consequences that rarely make headlines yet shape long-term outcomes. When trade barriers are introduced, the first reaction is measurable. Prices adjust, markets react, and political rhetoric intensifies. The deeper transformation begins later as governments, when tariffs interfere with refining routes or export economics, material can become stranded or rerouted inefficiently. The second hook emerges here. Physical availability and market pricing can diverge. Paper markets may suggest in times of economic stress, market attention naturally gravitates toward gold, reinforcing its reputation as the ultimate crisis asset. Headlines highlight central bank purchases, price breakouts, and historical comparisons, creating a powerful narrative of safety. Yet beneath this spotlight, silver operates in a very different way. While gold reflects fear and capital preservation, silver absorbs pressure from the real economy. This contrast is the first hook. Gold measures anxiety, but silver measures strain. And strain is often what reshapes markets most decisively. Silver's sensitivity to economic pressure comes from its deep integration into industrial activity. When trade tensions, tariffs, and geopolitical shifts begin to alter production patterns, silver feels the impact directly. Manufacturing slowdowns, defense spending increases, energy transitions, and technology demand all leave fingerprints on silver consumption. Gold can rise simply because investors are nervous, but silver moves when systems are forced to adapt. This makes silver less of a headline asset and more of a signal, quietly translating policy stress into market behavior. Another overlooked dimension is timing. Gold tends to react early in a crisis, benefiting from immediate fear-driven flows. Silver often lags, not because it is weaker, but because its response requires confirmation through industrial channels. This delay creates the illusion that silver is underperforming or irrelevant. The second hook lies here. Silver does not rush, but when pressure becomes structural rather than temporary, its response can be faster and more forceful than expected. Markets frequently underestimate this phase shift. One of the most significant of these effects is reshoring. Faced with tariffs and unreliable trade relationships, companies begin to prioritize domestic or regional production. This is not driven by efficiency, but by resilience. Supply chains are redesigned to minimize exposure to political risk, even if costs rise. Over time, this shift redirects capital toward infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, and strategic industries within national borders. These investments create sustained demand for raw materials and industrial inputs, subtly reshaping commodity markets long after the initial tariff announcement has faded from public attention. Defense spending is another powerful second-order consequence. Economic pressure on alliances often translates into increased military budgets, particularly when geopolitical trust weakens. Nations seek self-reliance, upgrading technology, stockpiling resources, and expanding industrial defense capacity. This spending is not cyclical. It tends to be sticky and long-term. The second hook emerges here. Defense-driven demand does not wait for economic clarity. It accelerates in uncertainty. This creates persistent pressure on strategic resources that markets frequently underestimate. Monetary behavior also shifts under these conditions. As trade fragmentation increases, confidence in coordinated economic policy declines. Central banks and sovereign institutions respond by diversifying reserves and reducing dependence on any single system. This quiet recalibration of monetary strategy is rarely discussed in public forums, yet it alters capital flows in profound ways. Assets perceived as politically neutral or historically reliable gain attention not because of speculation, but because of necessity. What makes second-order effects particularly valuable for strategic thinkers is their predictability, and while first-order reactions are chaotic and emotional, second-order responses follow logic. Businesses seek stability, governments seek security, and investors seek durability. The third hook lies in recognizing that these motivations repeat across history. Those who understand this pattern do not chase volatility, they position for inevitability. Hidden opportunities are born in this space between perception and reality. While public debate focuses on immediate winners and losers, structural shifts are already underway. Markets tend to misprice assets that benefit from long-term adaptation rather than short-term shock. Second-order effects reward patience, analysis, and the ability to think beyond the obvious. In an environment shaped by tariffs and strategic tension, it is not the loudest signals that matter most, but the quiet forces that reshape the economic landscape from the inside out. So as you walk away today, remember this. Tariffs may divide nations, but they also reveal truth. They expose fragility, shift demand, and reward foresight. Whether you are an investor, a student of economics, or someone striving to think independently, train yourself to look beyond the obvious. Don't chase headlines, chase patterns. Don't fear uncertainty, use it. Because in every economic shock, there is a silent winner. And in every moment of pressure, there is a chance to rise. Stay alert, stay disciplined, and most importantly, learn to see what others overlook.